Hi, everyone. Welcome. Just giving a second for people to join. I'm so excited for this conversation that we're going to have. And please, you can, if you're watching this on Facebook, you can have a watch party to have some of your friends come and join. You can share it and get more people to come, which will allow more people to have access to this conversation. I'm going to explain a little bit about what we're going to be doing today, but first I'm going to hand it over to Vivian for a really important statement.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Vivian Topping. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Civic Engagement at the Equality Federation. My pronouns are she and they. We want to begin tonight by really acknowledging the difficult and traumatic times that we're in. The last few days have been full of sadness and anger, particularly for Black people, Indigenous folk, and people of color. We're in solidarity with our partner Outfront Minnesota in condemning the senseless murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police. We also must lift up Tony McDade, a Black transgender man who was murdered yesterday in the third officer-involved fatal shooting in Tallahassee. He has been repeatedly disrespected in death, misgendered by law enforcement and the media. These come in the wake of the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, a Black man murdered while jogging in Georgia, and Breonna Taylor, a Black EMT murdered in her own home. This is unconscionable. The murders of Black people by police and our very own neighbors are the consequences of a willful lack of action on racism and police brutality in America by those in power at the local and national levels. These injustices are unacceptable, and we demand that those in power do better. I will personally never understand the trauma that my Black, Indigenous, and people of color siblings are experiencing right now. I'm grateful to ALOK for continuing to hold space with us tonight and participating in this conversation, and for continuing to be a leader in our movement. Deep in my heart, I hope that we can come together to tear down the systems that are oppressing our communities and build a new world together. We'd like folks to join us in a moment of silence before we begin. We can start now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for beginning with that, Vivian. I think that this conversation we're going to be having today is really important, especially considering all the stuff happening around the world, to talk about the relationship between anti-trans legislation and the lived experience of hate violence facing predominantly Black trans people in this country. So we're definitely going to be really trying to focus on that intersection today. Welcome everyone to ALOK Talks Equality, which is so surreal because we're about to talk equality, meta. And I want to first begin by saying thank you to Equality Federation for partnering with me to do this. The sort of catalyst behind this conversation was that many people aren't aware of the hundreds of pieces of anti-trans legislation that have been introduced over the past few years. And when I speak about this, a lot of people just have never even heard about these before. And this is largely because after the realization of same-sex marriage, there seemed to be this mistaken idea that LGBT rights were accomplished in the United States, all the while leaving trans and gender nonconforming people kind of thrown under the bus. And issues facing trans and gender nonconforming people are never really elevated to the national stage, let alone to mainstream consciousness. And so what my hope is for today's event is that we can celebrate Equality Federation's longstanding work on anti-trans discrimination, and also that we can financially support Equality Federation in doing this incredible work. So unfortunately, organizations that are focusing on trans justice and trans rights tend to be under-resourced and underfunded, while the people who are trying to pass anti-trans legislation are quite funded and quite resourced. So it's really important to express our solidarity with trans and gender nonconforming people by supporting organizations that employ folks like Vivian, who are on the front lines of actually trying to resist this rising wave of anti-trans discrimination. So I have a background in grassroots fundraising, so I'm going to be making several pitches for tonight, but I believe that on the banner, you can see the address of where you can now donate, and the support goes a long way. So a little just outline of what to expect in the next less than an hour, we won't take too much of your time, is Vivian is going to begin by giving us the sort of state of the union on anti-trans discrimination, what kind of legislations that we should be paying attention to. And then, as you might have heard, I'm kind of doing so much PR everywhere, I have a book coming out called Beyond the Gender Binary. And so I'm going to be speaking about how these anti-trans legislations are part of a larger constellation of efforts to attack trans and gender nonconforming people, to try to locate what's happening at a more cultural and political level. And then we're going to have a back and forth, and then we're going to have some room for question and answer. So without further ado, Vivian.
Thank you so much, Alok, and thank you again for having me on and talking about this tonight. I really appreciate it. So again, my name is Vivian Topping. My pronouns are she and they, and I'm the Director of Advocacy and Civic Engagement at the Equality Federation. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but I'm from Michigan and have lived kind of all over, whether it's Massachusetts, Florida, Texas, probably been there. The Equality Federation is a movement builder and strategic partner to state-based organizations advocating for LGBTQ people. So if you live in Florida and you volunteer with Equality Florida, or if you know of Equality Michigan or Basic Rights Oregon, those are some of our members across the state or across the country. We have 38 members or 38 members across 42 members across 38 states, and we are really excited to be able to talk about this tonight. So when we think about the legislation that's been attacking transgender folks, we're looking back at the state legislative session this year. And so just to be really clear as we go into this, the current pandemic has actually deeply impacted a lot of this. Many state legislatures stopped meeting in early March because of the pandemic. And so many of these bills are either stopped for now or potentially coming back at some point. And so we're kind of in a really weird moment right now. The Equality Federation really believes in making sure that we can track these bills and follow this across the country. And so we do that through our equality tracker. I believe we're going to be able to post that in the banner in a moment. If you are interested in checking out the LGBT specific legislation across the country, go to our website and look at the equality tracker to view our map. That map tracks every single piece of LGBT specific legislation, whether that's good or bad. And it will divide it by state and show you information about how to access it. So this year, in state legislatures, there were 342 bills introduced that attack LGBTQ people across the country. On the good side, there were 807 good bills that were introduced across the country. And so tonight I want to start with the good bills and some of the good news that we did see during this legislative session. The state that I really would lift up is Virginia. So if you are in Virginia, or if you are a volunteer with Equality Virginia, this is your moment to say, hey, I did something really great this year. In Virginia, we were able to pass a lot of different pieces of pro-LGBTQ legislation. Our partner on the ground, Equality Virginia, led a coalition that was able to make Virginia the first state in the South to pass non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. There are now 20 states that actually include non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people in employment, housing, and public accommodation, meaning that in Virginia, you can now be protected from discrimination at your job, at work, at home, and in public spaces because of the work that was done on the ground. In addition to that, there were bills that were passed that would prohibit health insurance discrimination for against transgender people. They banned the harmful practice of conversion therapy in Virginia, and they made it possible for non-binary folk like myself to get an X gender marker on your birth certificate and your driver's license so that we can actually have identity documents that match who we are. And so I really want to say, if you're a part of that Virginia team, and I know there are many folks who did that work, many organizations that were part of that coalition, I really want to lift that up because it was huge, wonderful work that happened this year and a result of many, many years of people putting themselves forward and doing the work to really bring folks to this place. So on the bad news, So like I said, there were 342 bad bills introduced this year, bills that specifically attacked anti-LGBTQ people. 100 of those bills were specifically anti-transgender bills. Depending on the bill, it could cover a wide variety of different topics. Some of those bills will ban folks from changing their gender marker. Some of those bills are something like what we've heard before about a bathroom bill. But there were two really large focuses and focal points that happened this year. The first one were healthcare bans. These are bills that would prevent transgender youth from accessing life-saving gender-affirming care. And the second one were athlete bans that would ban transgender athletes from participating in sports. And just to give an idea of what some of these bills did, some of those healthcare bills, in addition to banning the option for transgender youth to be able to have gender-affirming care, they would make it child abuse for a parent to allow a transgender child to access gender-affirming care. They would imprison doctors. They would fine doctors. They would make it so that parents of transgender children who supported them and the doctors and medical folk who provided their care would be criminalized and thrown in jail for putting forth best practice medical care. I want to be really clear when we talk about what it means to transition as a young child. Mainly, that means a lot of work of just recognizing someone's name and pronouns, letting folks express themselves as they are. Yes, some folks do go on puberty blockers. Yes, there are some medical interventions, but all of those are things that should be between a child, their family, and their doctor. There is no reason for the legislature to get involved in each state. The athlete bans were a little bit different. Those bills focused a lot on this idea of transgender athletes participating in sports, primarily transgender women, and talking about what could happen and the kind of dangers of transgender folks participating in sports. To be very clear, there is no danger for a transgender person participating in sports, unless you're like me and you're bad at sports. Depends on the day. But what these bills would do in some states would subject transgender youth who were athletes to physical invasive exams to determine their assigned gender at birth. Some of them demanded genetic testing for transgender youth to determine what their actual gender was. And all of them were attempts to legislate transgender people out of existence. What you'll notice about those two categories is that both of them focus on transgender kids. And I think that is the most despicable thing that I think of for this legislative session, where we spent months talking about attacking transgender kids and making it more difficult for them to live their lives and be who they are. In terms of where these bills actually came from, so they're both kind of coming from misperceptions of real life situations that occurred. Those healthcare bans are really coming out of a case that happened in Texas of a young transgender girl whose parents were going through a divorce and were in a custody battle. The father didn't support her transitioning. The mother did. The father then whipped up right-wing media and brought a lot of attention to their case, saying that the mother was forcing the child to transition and spreading a lot of lies about what that meant for them. And then legislators got involved. People in Texas started talking. Senator Ted Cruz even talked about it and made a statement on it. Governor Abbott in Texas said that he was going to handle the situation once they came back into session. Fortunately, Texas doesn't come back into session until next year. And so they did not do anything on it. But this year, that really was the impetus for a lot of anti-trans bills that focused on this. And I want to talk about the human cost of that one for a moment, which is that looking at just that case in Texas, that family was harassed by right-wing media. The mother is a medical professional, and she had to deal with people calling her place of work and threatening her and her child to take away her kid. And just the kind of fear that this kind of bill that would make it so that parents of transgender kids who are trying to help their children live their lives, who are trying to help their kid be who they are, and who are trying to prevent their child from killing themselves, they were attacked by this bill, and they were put in danger by these bills. Those athlete bills come from a strong obsession from our folks on the right with what is under the pants of transgender kids in sports. There is currently a lawsuit in Connecticut related to transgender athletes and in Idaho, and we'll talk about Idaho in a moment, And the amount of harassment that has come out against transgender athletes in Connecticut and in Idaho and across the country has been obscene. There's been a lot of work being done to really help folks understand what it means to be transgender and why these bills are bad for the country and bad for our world. So there's a couple states that really had some notable fights this year. The first one that I want to lift up is Florida. Our member group there is Equality Florida. And first of all, I want to just hold them close to my heart today because of Tony McDade, because I know that they are feeling it right now and they are responding to that. And so thank you to our folks at Equality Florida. There were 8 anti-LGBTQ bills that were introduced in Florida. One of those was a medical care ban, that bill that would ban gender-affirming care for transgender youth. Equality Florida was able to defeat all 8 anti-LGBTQ bills. They were able to bring forth a cavalcade of constituents working and talking to their legislators and making sure that they knew that those bills were not right for Florida. Because of the folks in Florida who spoke up, because of Equality Florida, they were able to do that work and to really knock down every single one of those bills. And so I really want to say that was an amazing moment and a really grateful time for us. One of the harder stories is Idaho. And I really want to lift up some of the groups in Idaho right now. Add the Words. Idaho has been doing a lot of really good work there, as well as many of the local folks on the ground. The ACLU of Idaho, Planned Parenthood there have been doing a lot of really good work, and as well as a group called Legal Voice to advocate for transgender folks. They saw 2 bills in Idaho that passed, HB 500 and HB 509. HB 500 is a bill that bans transgender athletes from participating in sports. HB 509 is a bill that makes it impossible for transgender folks to update their birth certificates to have modernized identity documents. Both of those bills were passed through their legislature and signed by the governor just as the pandemic began. And so I want to be clear that in the opening days of the pandemic, the opening weeks, when we knew that this was bad, Governor Brad Little, instead of working to work with the legislature and figure out how to prepare for the pandemic or thinking about how to care for people, was obsessed with passing anti-transgender legislation that attacked children. That is what happened in Idaho at the beginning of the pandemic. That organization or that state has also now in a lawsuit because of that. And the ACLU has filed suit there as well to try to get rid of HB 500, as well as I believe Lambda Legal and a few of our other partners. The experience in Idaho is really difficult because those bills passed right at the beginning of a really traumatic event and are impacting transgender folks in Idaho in a really awful way. The last state that I would want to talk about is Tennessee. So Tennessee was actually the first state this year to pass an anti-LGBTQ bill. Back in January, they passed a bill that allows child welfare agencies and foster care agencies to discriminate against LGBTQ people based on their religious beliefs. And so that means that they could refuse to place a child with someone because of the organization's religious beliefs, or refuse to work with gay families, with queer families, with trans families because of their religious beliefs, and that's okay in Tennessee. Tennessee is also now back in session, meaning that their legislators are meeting right now. There are about 7 bills in Tennessee that were being taken up just in the past few days to talk about anti-LGBTQ bills. And to be clear, the Tennessee House is pushing these bills. The Tennessee House is currently taking up these bills despite a desire from other folks in the legislature, in the Senate, and the governor to talk about things that are related specifically to COVID-19 and not to talk about discriminatory language. But the Tennessee House has brought these up. 3 of those bills are dead now. Our partner in that state, the Tennessee Equality Project, is doing amazing work to knock those bills down and to make sure that they don't pass. But 4 of those bills are still in play in Tennessee. They are a variety of things. Some of them are anti-trans, some of them are focusing on marriage equality, some of them are religious bills. I believe Dion, our person who's running this, is going to be able to post a link to the Tennessee Equality Project's action page. So if you live in Tennessee, you can click this link, go to the Tennessee Equality Project page, and contact your legislators. That will be a huge help. The only way that we defeat these bills that we've seen, and that we've seen time and time again in every legislative session, is that when they come up, we must come back and be able to make sure that legislators hear from their constituents. And so if you live in Tennessee and you're able to talk to your legislators, please go to the Tennessee Equality Project page and click their action page. So we talked a lot about specifically anti-transgender bills. I want to make sure that folks know that there's a whole host of other types of anti-LGBTQ bills that have been introduced this year. Some of those bills focus on chipping away at marriage equality. And so, like Alok said, we got marriage equality and people thought that things are done. But what's been happening over the past 2 years is that states are continuing to try to chip away at marriage equality by basically making it so that LGBTQ families will not be valid, whether it's by allowing county clerks to not put their name on a queer marriage license, or if it's about trying to take away benefits from married queer couples that straight couples would get. It is a difficult moment right now when we're looking at those bills because they are attacking rights that we already have. In addition to that, we also are seeing a significant number of bills that use religion as a sword to discriminate and to attack people. I talked about the adoption discrimination bill in Tennessee. There are countless other bills across the country that have been introduced that focus on using religion to attack LGBTQ people. I want to be clear that we know that religion and faith is something that that many folks hold dear across the spectrum of identities. And that is not a weapon. That is not something we should be using to attack LGBTQ people. It's not right. It's discrimination at the end of the day. We're also in this moment where the Supreme Court could any day rule on our rights. There's multiple Supreme Court cases that are currently waiting for a decision, primarily talking about Amy Stevens, a now recently deceased transgender woman from Michigan, my home state, who was fired from her job because she was transgender. And the Supreme Court is currently looking at whether or not LGBTQ people can be fired from our jobs because of who we are. That decision could come out any day now, and we're waiting to see what will happen. I think at the end of the day, this is a really difficult moment for a lot of folks, and I'm really grateful to have folks on with us tonight. Alok, I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Vivian, for that incredibly comprehensive overview of what's happening across the country. Dion, if we could put that equality tracker on again. For me, that equality tracker is so important because you can actually hover over each state and see the names of every bill that are being debated and introduced in each state. And every time I look, there's new ones that I'd never even heard about. And it's so important that we continue to refresh that. And that's why I think it's important to also follow Equality Federation on social media, join the mailing list, because they are always sending updates about this kind of legislation so that you don't necessarily need to know what exactly is happening in Idaho or Wyoming or Alabama, that this information can actually come to you. And just putting in another plug, grassroots fundraising, why it's important to also support organizations like Equality Federation who are doing this work of tracking so that we don't have to do it ourselves. So I wanted to speak a little bit about more of the human cultural impact of this legislation. As Vivian mentioned, this gives permission to people who already had anti-LGBTQ attitudes to express and publicly articulate their anti-LGBTQ violence because the state government is literally telling them that it's okay. And this leads to a mental health crisis among LGBTQ people, but especially young LGBTQ people. The Trevor Project says that 73% of young people report that contemporary politics have an influence are influencing their mental health. And we know that there's been an ongoing crisis of depression and suicide faced by young LGBTQ people, and this legislation is a forum that helps justify anti-trans abuse and violence. And it also is something that's being discussed in the news. People are having to watch TV and having to hear that their lives are less worthy than other people, and that's just not okay. But I also want us to think about these laws in a more holistic sense. So what I do in my forthcoming book, Beyond the Gender Binary, is I show how oftentimes this legislation doesn't use the words LGBT, or even if they do it in a kind of insidious or like back-ended way, where now they're using these smoke screens to justify their homophobia and transphobia, because they recognize that there would be public backlash if they were just explicitly homophobic or transphobic. They've devised innovative ways to do homophobia and transphobia, but using other rhetoric. So, for example, and correct me if I'm wrong, Vivian, but when it came to the Amy Stevens case, the way that she was discriminated against was they used a dress code violation, right?
Correct.
Right. So they knew that they couldn't say, we're firing you because you're trans, but what they said is, we're firing you because you're not complying with the dress code. But that's a larger metaphor for the ways in which religious freedom, dress code violation, increasingly biology and science, and all these other sort of smoke screens are being used as a way to implement anti-LGBT violence. So in my book, I talk about 4 main kind of categories of anti-trans discrimination that we're seeing in the US right now. The first one is dismissal. So there's this ridiculous idea that non-binary and gender non-conforming people in particular, because we continue to be the brunt of so much of this ire and frustration, that we're just making up words, and that therefore we do not deserve to have protections or even acknowledgement from state legislators, that this is just ridiculous and we're snowflakes who just have nothing better to do with our time than pretend to be oppressed, right? And that always makes me laugh, because all of English was made up and literally every single law was made up. What they have a problem is when LGBTQ people make up laws and when LGBTQ people make up language. And that actually there wasn't the same frustration when the word tweet was introduced as a word, because people understood that as time changes, we need to develop new vocabulary to describe concepts, that there are new concepts that emerge that deserve to be recognized by language, right? And the purpose of language, let me remind you, is to more effectively communicate. So if people are developing new words to be more precise, that's a victory for all people. Then the second thing that we're seeing is inconvenience. There's an idea that there's such a small community. Why should we have to change gender markers for such a small community, right? First of all, we don't know how many trans and gender nonconforming people there actually are, because in many states across the United States, it's still, let alone in many cities and towns, it's still incredibly difficult to live an openly trans or gender nonconforming life. And so when those of us are working in trans and gender nonconforming space, we don't make assumptions about numbers. We're actually just trying to create the infrastructure so that if people wanted to disclose, they could, and that they would have supportive resources. And then secondly, isn't the entire foundation of a democratic system to protect minority rights? But it seems that when it comes to trans and gender nonconforming people, we're not legitimized as a real minority. There's this idea that you can somehow support us without being inconvenienced, which is the third sort of thing that I see happening. They'll say, oh, this is just an inconvenience to actually have to change these laws to address these insignificant people. But I think in this moment, especially as we're speaking about the onslaught of police violence, it's important for those of us who are not Black, it's important for those of us who are not poor, and it's important for people who are not trans and not gender nonconforming to recognize that the way that rights, dignity, and justice are afforded to marginalized people is precisely through being inconvenienced, that we have to commit to being inconvenienced for one another, and that inconvenience actually creates a society that is more just and more dignified. And then the fourth thing, which we're going to go into a little bit more, is biology. And this is really frustrating to me, because when they say biology, what they're really meaning is reproductive. And that's a complete erasure of what biology is. I have a biological nose. I have a biological ear. Biology just refers to life matter. And in this moment when we're politicizing everyday people pretending to be epidemiologists, I want us to bring that energy of how everyday people are pretending to be biologists when they actually have no basis in real biology. Thousands of scientists across the world have said that the idea that biology has a binary is a social and cultural construction and has no basis in real biology. And in fact, when trans and gender nonconforming people are doing our organizing, we're actually calling for more precision when it comes to biology. What do you mean when you say biological? Because last time I checked, there are many ways to be and look like a woman, not one way to be and look like a woman. What these laws are actually trying to do is to standardize womanhood as childbirthing, which is one of the most sexist and patriarchal things I've ever heard in my life, that women should just be defined by their reproductive capacity. And besides, there are many cis women who actually are incapable of being pregnant, and there are many men and non-binary people who are. So it's really important to recognize that biology is not some sort of objective truth that exists outside of culture and politics. It's defined and informed and written by culture. And that's not to say that trans and gender-nonconforming people are not interested in talking about anatomy or science or bodily distribution. In fact, we're interested in being honest and not relying on stereotypical categories and actually looking at the real data. So now I want us to have a larger conversation about how these anti-trans legislations inform contemporary violence against trans people. And one of the points I want to make before we have a back and forth about this is, especially when it comes to identity markers, a lot of people don't understand what's happening. Many trans and gender nonconforming people in this country have been effectively disenfranchised by voter ID legislation that makes it so that your ID has to look a certain way, and that if you come to the polling booth and you don't look like what your ID photo has or the gender marker on your ID photo, you can literally be turned away from voting, which disenfranchises the population, which allows for politicians to be elected who end up passing anti-trans and racist policies. Another example is if you are stopped by police, which unfortunately Black, Latinx, and Indigenous folks in this country are more likely to be, and your gender identity is not, your gender expression is not consistent with your identity documents, then the police can use that as fodder to harass you, which leads to more violent altercations. When we're speaking about anti-trans discrimination in the workplace, oftentimes trans and gender nonconforming people have to work in lower paying jobs because there's no workplace discrimination protections elsewhere, or they may be fired elsewhere. So they're effectively funneled into economic trajectories, which make them have to live in certain neighborhoods, live certain lives, and be more hyper-policed by the police and by governmental authorities. And this is all part of a calculated strategy of multiple sort of prongs. It's kind of has many heads. On the one hand, it's about trying to find ways to extinguish trans life while washing its hands clean. And it's important to be washing our hands right now, but it's not important for governments to be washing their hands of complicity. So to reproduce policies that actually make it seem like it's individual people's fault for experiencing harm and violence, and not a calculated straight strategy. And then second, it's about making the category of sex and gender fixed, as in we have no ability to self-determine or self-declare. And this is something I'm going to ask Vivian about. When it comes to intersex rights, it's interesting how they change their tune when it comes to that. And then secondly, it's about making sex and gender binary. They say that there's only two genders and two sexes, but what they don't talk about is all of the money and legislative effort that goes into defining sex and gender as to a binary. That this is actually the product of specific policies and practices, not just some a priori objective reality. Okay, I could go on forever, but I want us to have a little back and forth. And we've been receiving your questions. Dion has generously been sending them over. So we're going to incorporate some of these questions into our dialogue. First, Vivian, I want to talk a little bit about, we've had this conversation on intersex rights, and how intersex actually is really important to understand how the state is defining sex right now. Can you let people know a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is a lot of amazing work that's happening around intersex rights, and I'm really grateful to see folks doing that work right now. What I would say is that a lot of states aren't even understanding that at this point. There's more work to be done. There's more work to be done telling the stories of intersex people and lifting up the stories and experiences of intersex folk. What I will say is that when we look at these medical care bans that focus on like outlandish lies about surgery that transgender children could have, or things that could be done to transgender children, they always have some kind of exception for intersex surgeries every time. And so like when we look at these legislators who are talking about not wanting to perform like these dangerous surgeries on children that, to be clear, aren't happening to transgender children who come out.
Right, that's fear-mongering media, and a really important point of this is that the actual lived experiences of trans and gender nonconforming people are not reflected in this legislation. What's often reflected is cis people's anxieties, projections that are codified into law.
Yeah, and when you ask them about the intersex piece, it doesn't get removed. They don't think about it. It's not even in their head. They allow that. They allow that kind of surgery to happen, and they allow that kind of abuse to happen to intersex people.
Right. Okay, so now I want to have a conversation around Tennessee. So it's my understanding that in Tennessee, there was this idea of expanding the public and actually trying to forbid trans and gender nonconforming people from existing in the public in a certain way. And for me, the way that I interpreted that is that this is part of a larger cultural effort to disappear trans and gender nonconforming people from the public so they can naturalize the idea that sex and gender are fixed and binary. But I'd love to hear more about how the Tennessee laws are defining public.
Yeah, so this is an attempt last year. It didn't go through, fortunately. What the Tennessee legislators tried to do was to expand their indecent exposure laws to include places like locker rooms and gyms and other places that are areas that we expect people to be in various forms of undress, right? You're in a locker room in a gym, you're changing, like it's gonna happen, you may see something, don't worry about it. But what they explicitly did was said that they would include locker rooms as places of public accommodation, and that a diagnosis of gender dysphoria could not exempt you from that. Meaning that if I, as a trans femme person, went into the women's locker room at a gym, right, and I go and I'm changing, if someone sees me and takes offense at my body and how I look and the parts that I have on my body, they can claim that it was indecent exposure, and I could be arrested for that. And I could be put in jail because I was in a locker room changing to use the gym. Fortunately, that bill did not pass. But that is just an example of the extremes that people are going to try to, I agree with you, to try to legislate transgender folks out of existence. Because if you can't exist in public, if you can't go to a gym, if you can't go be a human being out in the world, you're at home and they are trying to erase us from the world.
Right, exactly. And one of the insidious bills that I was tracking that fortunately didn't pass was in Texas. Weren't they trying to give a $2,000 financial reward to report if you saw a trans or gender nonconforming person using the facilities next to you? And that's just an example of how these laws are not actually about safety, and these laws are not actually about justice. They're about giving license for people to persecute already vulnerable populations and communities. So some folks right now are asking, what if you're hearing about legislation in a state that's not your own? How can you support that effort to remove the anti-trans legislation in that state?
Yeah. So the first thing I'm going to say is that one of the ways that you can support that state and ensure that we are able to help that state organization if you don't live there is by donating to the Equality Federation. The work that you do, that work that we do, is able to lift up all of the organizations. We have some groups that have large members of large staff. They have a lot of folks on staff. We have some groups that are entirely volunteer run. When we are able to get fundraising, to be able to get moments from folks so they can give to the Equality Federation, we are able to spend more time supporting those organizations that don't have resources. And we're able to help them find better ways. We're able to connect them with more resources. We're able to help them fight against those bills. The second way is to sign up for that organization's list. Even if you don't live there, still sign up and support them financially too. Those organizations desperately need your support. Many of them are small, have little staff, and are often led by trans folks or by queer Southerners. Our organization in Tennessee only has 2 people for the entire state. In Louisiana, we actually have 2 members in Louisiana, the Forum for Equality and Louisiana Trans Advocates. Forum for Equality has 1 staff member, and Louisiana Trans Advocates has no staff members. And here's the thing, even with these small teams, or sometimes entirely volunteer teams, our members are able to beat back anti-LGBTQ bills. The only way that they can keep doing that is if you sign up, you help them, you support them, and support the Equality Federation with a donation. The last thing that I would say is actually talking to one of our partners. There's a group called NEAT, the National Equality Action Team, that puts together phone banks for states that are dealing with issues like this, that helps folks from other states call into that state and get folks to sign up to volunteer. And so if you want to do that, looking up the National Equality Action Team would be great. And I think we can get the link posted in here as well. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's really important to remember is, like, one of the best parts about this digital age is that we can actually support communities that are on the other side of the world, right? And so even if you're not in Idaho right now, we should all empathize with how folks in Idaho are having to combat 2 unconstitutional anti-trans legislations passed during a pandemic. So it's about actually connecting to Idaho-based organizations and supporting them with our resources, and then also trying to amplify that. Because one of the most profound tactics is also shaming these state legislatures at a national and international level. So the United States often postures itself as uniformly the most progressive LGBT country in the, or LGBT country, I wish, one of the most safe and accepting environments for LGBT people in the world. But what the story of this anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ legislation says is a very different story. So the United States needs to be shamed at an international level to say there's a discrepancy between how you're posturing yourself and especially the experiences of Black trans people and trans people of color in the United States who are experiencing incredible rates of violence, hostility, and legal discrimination. Another question that I had for you is about, I guess, the frequency that these bills are appearing. It's my understanding that like it's been within the past few years and that they're actually kind of moving in certain directions and with certain trends. And for me, that suggests that there's a coordinated effort where people are sharing notes about like, okay, we tried this in Alaska, so now we're going to try to win it in Delaware. So, and they're pushing it around. And I think one of the things that's scary to me is that the powers that be are more connected while the people who are resisting this are more separated. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I would say that when we think about part of the strategy behind some of our opposition on these bills, they're looking not just at states and legislatures, they're also looking at how does this impact people in the judicial level? What kind of court would it go to if they got sued? How could they get this to the Supreme Court? And so, like, number one is really understanding that our opposition does have a long view of what these kinds of things could be. In terms of the frequency of these bills, we've seen an explosion in anti-LGBTQ bills ever since marriage equality passed at the Supreme Court.
It's a backlash.
It's a backlash, exactly. It is a specific backlash against LGBTQ people. And those bills have also explicitly focused more and more and more on transgender folks and on using religion to discriminate. When they're talking about transgender folks, they have had a preoccupation with transgender kids. If you look at the battles that we have actually had to fight over the past few years, they're focusing on transgender children. And they're also trying to own this idea of safety and privacy, saying that transgender folks are going to go into a locker room and assault someone or hurt somebody. You know, I worked for Yes on 3 in Massachusetts, which is the first statewide trans ballot question. We were able to defend transgender rights at the ballot in Massachusetts in 2018. And what our opposition said consistently was that if transgender folks have protections from discrimination and public accommodations, then they are going to go into a locker room or they're going to assault someone. When they were airing commercials, or when they were trying to air commercials about this law, they were showing a video of a young woman basically being attacked in a locker room. The same kind of thing happened in Houston in 2015 with the Hero campaign. And a shout out to all of our Houstonians who may be on today. The Hero campaign in 2015, the constant ad from our opposition was a black and white ad that looked like a horror movie, had a horror movie soundtrack of a little girl going into a bathroom and then potentially being attacked by an older man. The sexist patriarchal view of our opposition is that if transgender folks have rights, women and children will be in danger, you will be attacked, and transgender children need to be stopped. It is just a moment where we know that transgender folks are under attack and that our opposition is using arguments that seem preposterous to us, but to folks who have never met someone who's transgender, they hold on. And they are something that really can make folks feel like they are in danger, that their community is in danger, that their family could be in danger.
I remember reading an article about how in Anchorage, Alaska, when they were trying to do another one of these horrible bills, they were actually using models and video footage from places, people not even in Alaska, right? Yeah. And so it's really important to understand here that they are expert architects at fear-mongering, and they actually manipulate people's legitimate fears and anxieties and redirect them in the wrong direction, right? And that actually trans and gender nonconforming people are the most likely to experience gender-based violence. And that often gets minimized because of the demonization of our communities. And this is especially the case for people who are visibly gender nonconforming and people who are visibly dark-skinned. That oftentimes the precursor to a lot of this rhetoric is a latent racism. And that needs to be articulated because so often the face of transgender politics in the United States and life continues to be white, binary, beautiful, presenting people. But actually the people who are experiencing the brunt of the discrimination on the ground are visibly gender nonconforming Black and brown people, largely living in states that have made it really difficult to access medical and healthcare. Once again, this is all part of an orchestrated strategy of requiring people, of making people have to become visible such that they can experience violence, and then not actually being accountable for the lack of healthcare access, the lack of employment opportunities, the lack of affordable housing, the lack of gender inclusivity in all of this, right? So we're coming towards the end of our time. We don't want to take too much of your time, but I once again want to make a pitch, and then we're going to take a final question. So if you have a final question, please, please, please type it down, and we hope to get to it. So a lot of times it can feel really impossible living as a trans and gender nonconforming person in this country, because at every level, at the local, at the state, and the federal level, you're seeing some of the most draconian stuff happening to us. Like right now, the Trump administration is trying to redefine its protections on the basis of sex, such that trans and gender nonconforming people can be denied life-saving healthcare during a pandemic, right? And so we're hearing about this constant inundation of discrimination at every single level with little to no institutional support. And that's why it's really frustrating to me how the ask for cisgender people has often been, learn my names and my pronouns. That is the basic, that is the like 101. We're not just trying to acknowledge oppression, we're trying to end oppression. And in order to end oppression, we actually have to realize that there has to be resource reallocation. And what's happening in this country right now is that these trans bills are popping up because there's not a well-funded resistance, and that the people who are passing them have a lot more resources than the people who are actually resisting against them. So I think it's really important to connect with local LGBT organizing and to support foundations and organizations that are resourcing people on the ground, like Equality Federation. And Vivian, I guess maybe if you could tell people about some of the work that Equality Federation is doing during the pandemic. I know that you're going to be doing these webinars as well, and trying to build the political capacity of people on the ground.
Yeah, so like a lot of other organizations across the country, we were deeply impacted by the pandemic. You know, we already are actually a remote organization. We all work from home. And so that wasn't difficult. You know, I just had to still stay in my house. But it was still became this moment when we knew that all of our members, all of our organizations had to do a massive shift. And so we jumped to help them kind of do that, to help our folks really be able to move and say, okay, how do I adjust my work? And so that looks like meetings over Zoom with all of the organizers who are at our state equality groups across the country, working with each other, talking with each other about the work and how to do it, and providing a space for leaders of these organizations to really have a moment to just work it through. Today, as I was looking at the murder of Tony McDade in Florida, one of the things that really strikes me in that is difficult to carry is that when you work for an LGBTQ equality organization, particularly a state equality group, you are likely under-resourced because they don't get as much money as other organizations do. And you can't get away from the trauma. You can't get away from this. This is part of your job, to defend against this, to lead your community, to support people and to provide space for them. And so one of the really important things that the Equality Federation does is that we kind of help the health of the movement. We help those folks have a space to actually come forth and say, today is really hard and I don't know what to do. Where do I go? The other thing that we've had to really do is adjust our own programming and adjust our own work. Normally we hold in-person convenings with our members across the country to help them connect and help them do work. We've had multiple fundraisers that we've had to cancel. All of our in-person work for the rest of the year is canceled because we want to cancel in advance of public safety and make sure that people are able to be safe and not get sick. But we are holding our leadership conference, and this is a kickoff to our leadership connection this year, right? So we are over this next month and through June and up until July, are doing various different webinars and trainings for folks and working with our members, all culminating in a virtual conference that we're going to be doing that will be a week-long conference. And so, our main impact here is trying to make sure that the movement can still survive through this work.
Right. And also trying to ensure that in this moment, we're seeing rollbacks on protections across the world, like in Hungary, where they've now effectively banned trans and gender nonconforming people from being recognized legally. What's happening is that conservative powers are once again manipulating this crisis as a way to advance rollbacks that they've been trying to do forever, making abortion access more difficult, all these other things. And so we have to really remain vigilant to ensure that we are monitoring at the state level and the local level, and that we're also showing up for each other, because this is about mutual aid and about also checking in on trans and gender nonconforming people that in these states like Missouri that have so many laws being introduced this year alone, and also safety strategizing on what that looks like to get people access to affirming employment, affirming healthcare, affirming resources, and remembering that we come from that political tradition, that so much of trans and gender nonconforming organizing in this country historically has been about claiming space and then actually making space for other people.
I really want to lift up two things specifically kind of related to what you just were talking about. One, when it comes to mutual aid and that work, so many of our organizations have pivoted to directly supporting mutual aid efforts and trying to connect their members with mutual aid efforts and the folks in their communities. And so in some cases, setting up their own work. So I think some of the groups that have been really strong in this, Freedom Oklahoma, who are a roughly 3-person team, if I'm correct. They are a roughly 3-person team for the state of Oklahoma. They actually had a big win this year where they actually had a pro-LGBTQ bill that was heard in their legislature for the first time. They also have had some local cities pass non-discrimination ordinances. But right when this pandemic happened, they jumped into action and started working with their coalition of progressive organizations on the ground to ensure that, one, their state was taking the right policy actions to support folks during COVID-19, whether it was closing the state or moving in the right direction. They also started connecting folks with mutual aid efforts. And also some other organizations like the Transgender Education Network of Texas, who are a 1-person shop and then an all-volunteer board and all-volunteer otherwise besides their executive director. They have actually created a COVID relief fund for trans folks in Texas. And so they're doing a lot of really amazing work on that. And I think when we think about how to support right now, if you need something to do, if you're I don't know what to do right now and I want to impact the pandemic, supporting organizations like TENT, the Transgender Education Network of Texas, like Freedom Oklahoma, like the Equality Federation, that can get direct work and direct help into the community.
Thank you so much, Vivian, and thank you to the Equality Federation, and thank you so much to everyone who's watching. This is going to be available to share on Facebook and on my page as well. And so if there are people who you think really could benefit from this conversation, please direct message them, tag them, get this information out there, and also spread the word about Equality Federation. Join the mailing list, give a donation, and also check out the Equality Tracker to monitor what the anti-LGBTQ legislation looks like in each state. Okay, have a great day, everyone. Love and need you.
Bye, folks.